Today we have Thorsten Dittmar on the podcast. He's the founder of Polypoly, a data cooperative in the EU. This podcast I'm really excited about because it brings together themes of privacy, data governance, security, privacy regulation, encryption, cooperatives, multi-party computation, data algorithms, and maybe Web 3.0, but more as a backdoor to Web 3.0. And I'll get into that a little bit. So I was on a mission to bring to this podcast a data cooperative. And I'm looking to bring more under different flavors. And I truly believe that this notion of a data cooperative is the shape of things to come. Now, there's no reason that the default model for personal data is that it is centrally stored and processed. Data privacy laws make this expensive, even for confidential data. Why create the honeypot? Moreover, a stale honeypot because a single source of data comes with the decay of the value of that data. And of course, then there's the trust factor. So that brings us to privacy enhancing technologies, which can either be a closed system or more decentralized, distributed models like what is enabled by secure multi-party computation. But Polypoly hits it from a different angle. And we'll get into that into the podcast. It's a 2-hour podcast. And I wanted it to take it as much time as we needed to go through it because it hits on so many things that are critical to the encrypted economy for the years to come. So I talked a little bit about Web3. I don't have it in the podcast episode because Thorsten doesn't care about how we categorize what Polypod is focused on in terms of Web 2 or Web 3. He's a builder. He's looking to solve a problem. Web 3 is more of a term from his perspective that may be used when you're looking to raise capital. So rather than focus on new terms and adding new terms onto this new world, he draws analogies to how we currently use and share data in the real world. And that makes a lot of sense. We have more of a history in the real world versus the virtual one. Polypoly is not about Web 3.0 per se, but oddly, it seems to lay the groundwork for what a lot of people talk about when they talk about Web 3.0. Since taking control of your personal data and setting parameters around what sites you interact with is sort of a fundamental tenet of what most people define as Web 3.0. And maybe this is actually what's supposed to happen with Web 3.0 is that people don't run around saying, I'm doing Web 3.0, but people are addressing data ownership and the self-sovereignty of data in their wallets and assets in their wallets and their interactions with the web. And really, why should builders be focused on the canonical order of web infrastructure? Polypoly is focused on returning data control to the individual and enabling the individual to set the rules for their interaction with those seeking to process such data. They are agnostic whether that control is versus a Web 2 or a Web 3 architecture. So I poke around later in the podcast asking Thorsten about whether they could collectivize the computational power, which he talks about on this podcast, or acting through a decentralized server and contribute data to that with the decisions on interactions made by a community. This decentralized centralization could provide the co-op or perhaps a group within the co-op, I didn't say sub-DAO, with more market power and trusted stewards to manage how that data was used to benefit projects which met the criterion for the group. It's just an exploration on my part, possibly also a direction that I think data cooperatives should go. Anyway, I'm so excited for this podcast and to bring it to you. Really been leading up to this for a while. If you like the podcast, share it. I guarantee you there's a ton of people out there who would find this really interesting and just haven't really delved into the topics in the way that we have on this podcast. So anyway, please share it. If you like us, please like it in the podcast app. And until next time. Welcome to The Encrypted Economy, a weekly podcast featuring discussions exploring the business, laws, regulation, security, and technologies relating to digital assets and data. I am Eric Hess, founder of Hess Legal Counsel. I've spent decades representing regulated exchanges, broker-dealers, investment advisors, and all manner of fintech companies for all things touching electronic trading with a focus on new and developing technologies. So on today's episode of The Encrypted Economy, I'm so excited to have Thorsten Dittmar on the podcast. Thorsten is the co-coordinator of the co-op Polypoly. And this has been a topic that has really fascinated the encrypted economy. So Thorsten, welcome to the Encrypted Economy.
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me.
So maybe we start off like we do all our podcasts. Give us a little bit about your background and what brought you to Polypoly.
Yeah, I started my tech career late in the 70s. So long ago. So we were really involved in all these early stage tech things in their first agile project in the world, and and wiki stuff, and stuff, technology which is nowadays common. Then I sold my first venture around about 15 years ago and went to Africa, working there as a social impact investor, directly in Africa. Not from the desk safe in Europe. No, I was really into there. When I started with computer science, very first touch I had with computers was about hacking. I was not really a good hacker, but it was easy to be a hacker in the late 70s, and it wasn't illegal because there were no laws against hacking. So I still had these network of people thinking about data privacy, security, and what kind of role should the internet play for us. And around about already 7 years ago, I got in touch with some people who were researching around that whole area of how the data of Facebook is used for political things and so on and so forth. And I helped there a bit. And when I got in touch with all these stuff, I got really, really nervous. Of course, for me as a tech dude, it was clear to a dedicated extent what's going on with in that data economy and social media and so on and so forth. But when I start helping that people to understand all these technical elements, I got deeper into that topic and said, hey, my dear, what's happening there? That these data is now used to change the behavior of people and so on and so forth. And so I said, hey, we have to fix that problem because it is really a serious problem. Yeah, that was basically when I started thinking about how can we fix that. And my first intention was to find a company who was doing so already and just investing in it. But unfortunately, we were not able to find one which is really trying to fix the problem and not just dealing with the symptoms. And that was basically then the start of Polypoly.
So your interest in privacy, I know, your background, it seems like it was sort of a building interest, but do you recall like maybe a single event that just was so meaningful that shaped you, like, or you can just sort of recollect, like, when this happened, I suddenly had this realization? Like, was there that epiphany, that moment that just sort of brought it, that really shaped your values or worldview?
My personal background, I'm coming from a worker family. I was born in Germany with all this history of that country. And when I start thinking about all these data economy and privacy stuff, I had a chat with a guy who said, it is really difficult to understand what data can be used. And he came up with an example from our history in Germany. And that was basically that all the churches had registries for the kids that were born and people died. And, we have Protestants and Catholics here basically. And that, during that time, this example is coming from, nearly everybody was in one of these two churches. And so when the Nazis came in charge here in Germany, they took these two registries. And I would say, normally you would say it should not be a problem to know who was born where and when and so on and so forth. But by combining these two registries, they had an idea who was not part of these two churches. So by being not in that registry, they were able to say, hey, you are maybe Jewish. That was an eye-opener, saying, hey, okay, from time to time, it is not about the data or the data which is known about you. Also the data that is not known about you can be a huge problem for you sooner or later. And you never know what will happen in future. So maybe today to be gay is not a problem anymore. Hopefully that will be the case forever. But, if the regime will change in your country and that data is public, then you can be in real big trouble, And so that's that, when I had this chat with this guy was a researcher, for history stuff and so on and so forth. And he really told me how all these data was misused long before we had computers. And, if you just think about that, how can all these data we are generating will be misused or can be misused in future? Don't get me wrong. We need data. We need data for solving some of our issues in our society, and it's necessary for our businesses and so on and so forth, it's most likely that we will need even more data than we have today. But if so, then we have to have a way that nobody can misuse it. So yeah, that was really an eye opener for me. Say, okay, we really have to go into that one. We have to fix it. Because we will generate more and more data for sure, with all the IoT devices and so on and so forth. And privacysphere is one of the core values of our, democracies and societies. I would say it's one of the core elements of humankind. Because, we are living in groups, but still, what is in my head is just in my head. As long as I'm not speaking it out, it is in my head. So yeah, that was really that event where I said, okay, no. Do it, fix it.
That's a powerful story. When you think of like the large data aggregators, there's like a twofold risk, of course. Yeah. There's one where the people who are aggregating the data suddenly decide to use it in a way that's not permissible. And then there's obviously the big honeypot effect, where if you aggregate it all in one place, then, Google or Facebook may be completely benevolent, but quantum technologies find a way to access the whole database, and suddenly everybody's saying, wow, how did this happen? How did all this data get assimilated into one large entity? And now there's a full exploration of how to use it to our detriment. So that is a powerful story. So thanks for sharing that. And so maybe before we even begin, I'm going to ask you, I'm just going to take a big step back, because there's a lot for us to talk about here, and I'm really excited about it. But let's just take a big step back. And I'm going to ask you, Americans and Europeans have very, our regulatory structures is one thing. Clearly, they're different. The U.S. tends to protect sectors like financial, health, anything within those sectors, that's what's protected. Now you have the California also focusing maybe more on consumer uses. And in Europe, it's a very different approach. It's saying we're protecting the residents wherever it's used, wherever it's in the world under GDPR. But even from an attitudinal perspective, what is the difference between Americans and Europeans on data privacy? What are your thoughts on that? You don't have to be nice, but
I was born in an area what you would call the Rusty Belt. So we are direct, and that means from time to time I'm maybe not so nice, but let me try to be as precise as possible. So first of all, privacysphere in general, not only data privacysphere, is something that is embedded deep into our culture, and it is how we are defining privacysphere is also something that derives out of our culture. So even in Europe, people in the south of Europe would define privacysphere differently than, for example, in the northern part of Europe. Also, how open people are to share data with their governments is highly different. For example, here in Germany, of course, we have this history we just talked about. And that is saying, or that the result of that, or one of the results is that we are not so open to share our private data with our government. So in the northern part of Europe, totally different. They have a very, very strong relationship to their countries, and they are willing to share much more data and so on and so forth. In the States, I guess it's also, people in Texas would maybe behave different than in Portland or in New York or whatsoever. But in general, when I'm comparing these two systems in the US and in Europe, you are much more on that let me say, try out things, and if it fails, try to fix it. And we are more on that, let us think about that first, and then we make a step. Both have pros and cons, and so there is no right or wrong here on that point. But in general, I would say privacysphere is first at all a very, very subjective thing. So, what you would call private for you is maybe different than what one of your friends would call private. So, whatever our law system is saying is secondary. Primary is what I'm saying personally, for my data, my rules, very simple. Of course, we need laws to empower that. No doubt about that. But just because something is covered by GDPR or maybe not covered by GDPR, I can still declare something as private, what is not covered by GDPR. So if you have a system which is balancing the interests between the citizens, the government, and the economy, right, then you're not running into a problem. So if all of them are on eye level, no problem at all. Then you can do whatever you want to. But as soon as the system is getting out of balance. And from my point of view, we are here in a system which is totally out of balance. I would say even at Amazon or Facebook or Instagram, all these there's nobody in that company, in these companies, who really knows what is going on with this data. All these systems are so complex, and they're changing their systems every day. Yeah. So you just said maybe Facebook or Google are unhackable. I would say no. Nobody is unhackable, because all of them are constantly, it is like, as you said, a honeypot. It's a building like Fort Knox, with one big difference. There are lots of handcrafters running around these Fort Knoxes and rebuilding that building all the time. So because that's what all these data economy and digital economy is about, changing business models, experimenting here and there, blah, 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 blah. So you have a honeypot, maybe behind a huge security wall with lots of small doors here and there, because the handcrafters have to go there to do their job. Yeah. So, but coming back to your question, I would say that depends really. It is not that there is a big difference between the US and Europe here. There are some differentiators here, but in general, I guess we have a very similar way of what is private and not. The only difference here is, what is our approach when we are trying to tackle something new? And so that's from my point of view, the main difference. And if you look at what is going on in California, it's basically quite a good adaptation of what we have here in Europe with GDPR. Lots of other countries are doing the same thing. Is this answering your question?
And you've used the term private sphere. Is that the term that you've used? It's just for the listeners. I want to circle back to it because it is sort of a part of what Polypoly does. Could you sort of define the private sphere for the listeners?
Yeah. So private sphere means for us. So when you're going to GDPR, there's a list of kind of data which is covered by GDPR, and that's quite a big scope. Nevertheless, there can be also elements or data which belongs to me in a way that is more on the meta level, or for example, where you cannot really. Let me make a concrete example. So I have a relationship, for example, let me say there's a digital relationship between me and my mom. So when we would have both of us, and we don't have, but nevertheless, if we would have a Facebook account, my mom and me, and we would exchange messages there on Facebook, we are called friends. So if I would download my data from Facebook, that's not typical for Facebook, same thing with other companies, there is then an aspect where you cannot say clearly, is this data entry really belonging to me or is it belonging to my mom? And then what typically happens is, even if my mom and me would download our data, in the middle, something would be missing. Yeah. So there is something in that kind of relationship which is owned by Facebook. They would not hand it over to me or to my mom. So in the real world, I would say, hey, no, that's part of the relationship between me and that person is not owned by a third party. It is owned by us. Yeah, but not by a third party. And it would be part of my private sphere. So that's, let me say, in addition to what is covered by GDPR, what we would also declare as private sphere.
Yes, and then I guess one other point on the big aggregation. I mean, if there's one thing that the SolarWinds hack taught us is that even Microsoft is far from immune. And I mean, with the SolarWinds hack, there is so much that we as the public don't know, and probably is not in our interest to know. But the extent of the damage has been significant. And
agreed.
and to think that Microsoft is any less secure than Facebook or Google or Amazon, think again. I mean,
you should never forget, what we're talking about here is an art which is quite young. If you're talking about civil engineering, we have thousands of years of experience with civil engineering. Even the first bank is, when I have it correctly in mind, is 1,500 years old or something like that. When it comes to computer science, it is just 5 decades, 6 decades, a little bit more. Yeah. So it is more or less natural that we are making a lot of mistakes. I guess we're making more things wrong than right in technology, which is natural. It is a very, very new field. So we have to make things wrong. Yeah. And then we have to fix it.
Okay. And so, and before we're going to start getting into Polypoly in a second, but one question, another point of view, data privacy disclosures, are they working? Are they headed in the right direction? Is more disclosure better? Is it achieving its ends?
So from my point of view, this way of working is just dealing with the symptom, not with the problem. That's because, there is currently no fix for the problem. It's good to have that systems and to deal with the symptoms. We know that from the financial area. When you're coming up with regulations, how, financial stuff should work, then there will be some other smart guys who will find the hole in that regulation. And then you will build the next regulation and da 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 da. So it's a kind of a cat and mice game, is it called in Germany? I don't know if it is the same in English. They are working to a dedicated extent, but they're not really fixing the problem. They're just dealing with the symptoms. And that's not good enough because, when you're just dealing with the symptoms, you're not really able to build an alternative, which makes things even better. So from our point of view, we have to have a data economy, which is a booster for private sphere, and in parallel, a booster for business, and in parallel, a booster for research, and so on and so forth. So, more private sphere should mean better business, cheaper business, faster business, should mean better projects for our society, easier access for researchers, and so on and so forth. So, and that's, of course, something you cannot build with, these kind of technologies.
Great. So now at this point, for the listeners, we're about 20 minutes or so in. Can you tell us what Polypoly is?
Yeah, of course. So it is, of course, first of all, it is an idea about how to build systems for the data economy, and secondly, it's a company and a movement behind it, and so on and so forth. So before we will deep dive into our legal structures and all that stuff, I would like to talk about the fundamental idea of the technology first, if it is okay for you. So nowadays we have that system where the data is leaving me as a data subject and going somewhere else. It will be stored somewhere else and it will be computed somewhere else. So the data is going to the algorithm. And that's basically causing all the problems because, that is, as I said earlier, everything what is in my head is in my head. Nobody can see it. Only if I'm speaking it out loud. So that's exactly what we are doing nowadays when we're transferring data to other companies. We are speaking out loud what is in our head. And then it is not private anymore. So our idea is to turn that thing upside down. So you can phrase it like stop sharing data, start sharing algorithms. So instead of that, my data is going to a foreign country, to or company or whatsoever, the algorithm is coming to me as a user, and it will be computed locally on my devices. And just the answer, if an answer is needed, because for a lot of computations, there is no answer needed, just the answer is going. So that will turn everything upside down. So first of all, if the algorithm is computed on my device, it is clear which jurisdiction is in charge, because it will be computed in my home country. So the law of my country is in charge and not the law of any other country. It's also clear when there is some, let me say, monetary aspect involved, where the taxes has to be paid, because it is computed on my device. So the taxes has to be paid in my home country, and so on and so forth. So there are lots of legal impacts by turning that thing upside down, but also lots of financial or business aspects are involved here. All of us, we are spending a bunch of money for our own IT devices, our smartphones, our laptops, pads and whatsoever, PlayStations and so on and so forth. So in Europe, we are spending around about $500 billion every year on our personal IT devices. That also includes, smart refrigerators and, even the new cars are small supercomputers on wheels. Besides of that, all of them are consuming a lot of money. We are also using a lot of resources, rare metals and all that stuff to build all these things. But we are utilizing the computation power just by 5% on average. So 95% of the computing power of these devices are idling. They are unused. Just imagine, during night, all of your devices are idling. Even your smartphone, which is normally one of the most used devices, the processor is idling most of the time, because the processor and all these stuff is built in a way that when a peak is coming, like identifying your face to unlock the device, that's really needs power. Then the processor is working hard for some milliseconds, then it's falling in sleep again. There is a study which calculated that when you take 1% of all smartphones in the world, computing power, 1%, that would be that these cluster would be able to outperform Google search 4 times. So if just imagine, that means end of the day, the largest supercomputer we have in the world are we as citizens, not one of these big tech companies. We have much more computing power than all of them together. So, and all of these devices are paid already. So there is an infrastructure out there which is not utilized. Instead of, we are building new number crunching centers more and more and more, and we can just take all that data, which is currently stored about us somewhere, bring it back to our own devices, making an outsourcing deal with, we as citizens, we can make an outsourcing deal with the business and also with the government, saying, hey, if you want to know something about me, if you want to use my data for some calculations, just ask me and pay me for it. So simple. As you paid before Facebook, if you want to know what kind of digital advertisement is okay for me, no, ask me. Me personally, I can make a much better decision than Facebook would ever be able to, because, that's also one part of our solution. We are downloading the data to your personal devices from lots of different sources. So we have the Facebook downloader already out. The Google one is coming in a few weeks. Up to the end of the year, we have the download features for all the big players. So Amazon, Netflix, Pinterest, Instagram, call them. Yeah, and so all this data is going to your devices and will be cleaned up there all as well. So also the data quality, not only the pure amount of data, also the data quality is much higher than one of the big dudes will ever have. We are quite often talking about these tech guys like, data monopolists, which is wrong. They are data oligarchs. Yeah, so means they have some data, they have a lot of data, but for example, Netflix don't know anything about my media consumption at Amazon Prime or at Apple TV, and they would never exchange it. So, but if I'm downloading all that stuff to my device, if you would be the one who's building the best recommendation engine in the world, just run it on our infrastructure and would be able to make a much better recommendation than all of the others can do, because these recommendation algorithms would be able to use all your media consumption. Yeah, even the ticket for when you were in the cinema last week. So that's basically the fundamental idea. Saying, okay, let us bring the data back to us, enable others to use that data on our devices. There are lots of steps in between, because it's quite a radical change. Here in Europe, we are more with evolutions than with revolutions, at least in the last decades. And so we have to build a smooth transition for the economy to change from, centralized data storage to decentralized data storage and decentralized computation. But that's the core of the idea. We did a lot of experiments and also research. It really makes stuff much cheaper, also for the economy, and it would be we would be able to enable services yet that you cannot build today at all. Or at least not without harming the privacy of somebody heavily. And so having an idea how we can fix that from a technology point of view, of course, that's not good enough, because the tech part is normally the easiest part to fix. But then you have to think about how that all these legal things are working, how you're creating checks and balances, how you're doing your go-to-market strategy. And so that was then when we were start thinking about, what kind of legal body would be the right one for that approach. And to be honest, I've never founded a cooperative before in my life.
Before we get into the legal structure, because I really want to pick up on what you were just talking about in terms of the available computing power. And so as I understand it, Polypoly today is structured so that I have data on my personal devices. The algorithm comes to me for the processing of that data. I get paid, or the cooperative gets paid. You'll get into that. But there's a payment associated with that computational power, which I've had some experience with other models where it's like you get paid for your data. The problem
Yes.
is that those who have the most valuable data get paid
Yes.
much more,
Yes.
and they don't want to get paid. And the ones who have the
Yes.
least valuable data get paid less, and they want to get paid. So there's just a mismatch, which is why I love the equalizing factor of it. But let me just kind of push that notion one step further.
Please.
So let's say from a cooperative perspective, you have multiple members. Couldn't that combined computational power be utilized not only for an algorithm coming to a user's device for the processing of that user's data? Couldn't that collective also allow its computational power to be used pure computational in, we'll just say, in an encrypted format, which now gets a little more complicated, of course, but gets utilized in an encrypted format to perform other functions to thus increase the incentive to participate in the model and thus forwarding the privacy aspect of it at the same time?
Of course. So let me first say some words about what you said first. So when people get paid for data access, let me say, then private sphere is getting a luxury good. Yeah. So if you don't, if you're rich enough, you have data private sphere because you don't have to share your stuff. But for people in a poverty situation, or people who really have to take care of their money, for them, data private sphere is then something they have to think about. If they can, if it does, maybe worthwhile for them to sell their private sphere. Just translate it in the real world. Just let us forget for a second, that we are talking about computers here. Would you accept in the real world that, let me say, a door locker or a dress in general, having a dress, not being naked in public, is something that has to deal with how much money I'm earning? No, we would never accept so. Why should we accept in the digital world? So now privacy, also digital privacy, should not be a luxury good. It should be something that everybody is able to use or to establish for himself and to make private decisions about that one. So that was the first reason why we said, okay, we don't want to use that kind of incentive model, as more, you will make yourself naked in the digital world, as much more money you will get. That's definitely not a good idea. We should also don't forget here, data economy is a global system. So even if maybe most of the people in the US or in Europe would be able to say no to that. So, I'm not sharing data. I don't need that euros. There are other countries in the world where people are maybe poorer than in our home countries. And they have as well the right of, having a digital private sphere. So we said, okay, let us turn that thing upside down. So, okay, as you said, there are different ways how to utilize these kind of systems. The first one is what we just talked about is, sharing data and get paid for it. The second one is saying, okay, we will make that one a little bit smarter. So you're not just sharing raw data, you're maybe also, updating automatically the data on the company side and so on and so forth, and you're getting a little bit more money for that kind of smart data transaction. But the first, from our point of view, the first really good service here is what we call is a service transaction. So you're sending me an algorithm, and this algorithm is using my data in some way, doing some calculations, and I get paid for it. And of course, the next one is I'm just renting out computing power even without my data. And that's also something not new. Maybe you remember City at Home, when, the guys at NASA created that awesome screensaver. Basically, when I have it correctly in mind, I'm not 100% sure. It was because of a budget cut at NASA that they had not enough power or money to analyze all the signals from the radio telescopes. And so there was this smart person who said, okay, I will build a screensaver. And when, your Windows PC is idling, it can download data from our telescopes and try to find ET, then sending the data back. So there is an initiative called the Global Grid, where you have a lot of things like that. There's, for example, also something which is called folding at home. That was an approach to analyze the COVID virus. And so that's, of course, also part of the system, just renting out bare metal computing power without your data. But because we want to fix the data economy, the third one, so algorithms coming to my device, renting out computing power in the context of my data is for us in the moment the most important one.
On the use of computational power, this is a trend that you typically now see with programmable money, right? Because with programmable money, like for example, there's a platform called Render. It's an example. And Render basically is a network of decentralized GPU utilization. So for game developers who have a high demand for GPU, they're leveraging across this network and they're getting tokenized. So it's just, again, I think it's fascinating to think of your model as contemplating that power in the computational component of the offering versus just purely the data, because it does allow you a lot more flexibility, to your point, not to cause people to devalue their privacy incorrectly, or to focus on the wrong things. Like if I open my kimono more, I get paid more, and that's not really the framework. So anyway, we're on the same page, I guess.
Agreed. And we should not forget, it's not always about money here. It's also that let me say there's a university who wants to do some research and they don't have the money, but maybe I'm personally interested in that kind of research. Then I say, hey, you can use my computing power for free. Or there's so many scenarios, where you can use your computing power for charity or for supporting an organization you like to. And it's not always about, getting paid for computing power. When it, for example, comes to fixing problems like the climate crisis or the COVID stuff and whatsoever. If you're working hand to hand, also in the digital world, we can do a lot together, and we don't need any big tech company for that. All the technologies needed to do so are out there for decades. We just have to do it.
Right. And it's funny, we had a Nathan Schneider on the podcast, first episode in 2022, and the whole podcast was about this notion of common good in sort of the decentralized organization, and how does a community evolve beyond just simply the monetary? How does it engage the community? How does it tie into its members' interests and desires beyond just the monetary? And we talked a lot about this notion of common good and the evolution toward it. And that's sort of, you're sort of building it from the get-go, obviously, with that common good, trying to find that right balance between how do we monetize it so that people don't find it so that people want to do it, but also how do we tap into their broader beliefs and tap into a common good? I mean, I could imagine like a specific project gets posted to the community and the community members vote on it collectively and say, hey, we're all going to do this one collectively. And, it's exciting stuff. So with all that said, now we get down to the Polypoly structure. We started to talk about co-op, something near and dear to the encrypted economy. But please, let's talk about the structure.
So Polypoly is currently built out of three companies. One is a foundation, one is a classical enterprise, an INC, and one is a cooperative. All of them have totally different roles in that system. And so let us start with the co-op. So the co-op the legal body is called SCE. That's something typical in Europe, because it is one of the first companies or this legal body is one of the first legal bodies which is cross-country. So that means even if you're opening the SCE in Germany, you can make business, or it is basically they have subsidiaries in all of the European countries. But let us forget that for a while. The important part here is really that it is a cooperative, and that means it is owned by the citizens. And I'm not saying by purpose, I'm not saying users. So you can use the Polypod without being a member, and you can be a member without using the Polypod. But the important part here is that the underlying infrastructure, so what we are calling the Polypod, is not owned by the government. It's not owned by any other company. It's owned by the citizens. And you can only get a member in the Polypoly co-op if you have a European passport. That has a legal reason, very simple. We want to make it as hard and as difficult as possible for companies from other countries to legally harm that cooperative. So you as an American, you cannot get member of the Polypoly SCE. Now the Polypoly Foundation is coming into the game because the Polypoly Foundation has mainly the purpose to build co-ops in other countries. We are currently talking to people in Canada and India, also to a few people in the US, to build local co-op there, which can be then owned by the citizens there. That's, of course, not an easy structure, but we are doing so by good reasons. As we said earlier, the definition of what is private or not is depending highly on our culture. So a US polypod would maybe look slightly different, or I guess it would, because it should be adapted to your local culture, than in the US, than in Europe. And an Indian one would look slightly different or behave slightly different depending on their culture. It's also an important part of the co-ops to build local communities. So, for example, that the support community is local. So, if a person from Denmark using the Polypod is giving us a call on the support hotline, he should get somebody who's speaking Danish and who is a Danish citizen, who understands the Danish way of culture. So it is this game of think global, act local. So we will build a global system, but always based on local cooperatives, which are owned by local citizens. That is, for example, also needed to make sure that when say a Danish company is making a deal with a Danish citizen, that this is causing taxes in Denmark and not in Berlin, and also not in San Francisco. So same on the US level. If an American citizen is making a deal with an American company, hey, clear, the money should stay in the American community. So that's how that whole game is working between the foundation and the co-ops. The co-ops are more or less independent. The foundation is acting like a franchisee, giving the name and the brand and all these legal and governance frameworks to the new founded cooperative. But then all the cooperatives are more or less independent. They just have to make sure that the interface of the Polypod is globally the same, but they can decide what they want to do locally. Also, for example, how they want to work with the government together. So, for example, in Europe, it's much, much more difficult, for police to get private data from a citizen than in the US. So, that's your system. I'm not judging about it. So, but then it's important that the American cooperative is dealing with these aspects. We cannot do that globally. Everything should be local there. And then there's the Polypoly Enterprise. And the Polypoly Enterprise is basically building tools for the economy to make these shift from a centralized data storage to a decentralized data storage and decentralized computation as smooth as possible. So, and the enterprise is also owned by the economy. So it's basically some large European companies who have invested in that company, and we as the founders. But so we have then also two clear representatives here. The enterprise is representing the businesses, and the co-ops are representing the citizens. So if they are coming in conflict, we will see that clear, and we can see clearly where the problem is. If you put everything in one big company, then you can try to cover problems, but covering problems doesn't fix the problem. And it was by purpose made in that way that both sides have their own representatives, and that they have to work together. All the checks and balances are made in a system that in a way that they can only be successful together.
And and is there sort of a community component of engagement, like a local community, as well as a global? Like, in other words, are there common platforms for engaging globally as well as locally?
Yeah, there are there's a very, very huge network, and that was also something completely new for me, network of cooperatives in the world. So they are working heavily together, and you cannot overestimate how strong these cooperatives are. They are really, really big. We have in Europe really huge banks which are cooperatives. I know that you have in the US also quite a long tradition, especially coming from the farming area, cooperatives. So you can distinguish basically two kinds of cooperatives. I guess the right term in English is consumer cooperatives and workers cooperatives. We have something similar in Europe, but these digital cooperatives are in some way they're a mixture, let me say. Of course, our employees are normally also members. But here it is, consumer is also not the right word, because they are our users who are the owners of that company. Yeah? So they are not consuming something what we are producing. We are offering an infrastructure they are using to produce something. So maybe what is coming up here, and with all these digital cooperatives which are currently popping up here and there, is a new way how to think about cooperatives. But end of the day, the underlying idea here is that infrastructures should be not owned by, or they should be owned by the citizens. So, if you just look out of your window, there are streets. Are the streets owned by Chrysler? No. Are they owned by Ford? No. In these cases, they are owned by the government, which end of the day means owned by you. So, because privacy and data and governance is another story. So we said, no, we should not rely on an infrastructure which is owned by the government, so it should be owned directly by the citizens. That's the reason why we said, okay, let us build that as a cooperative.
But even in the U.S., I mean, there are worker cooperatives, there are user-focused cooperatives. Like California is a very active jurisdiction for worker cooperatives. Consumer cooperatives, one of the most famous one is REI, which is an outfitter, and basically you're a member of it, and you can benefit from discounts, et cetera. And then when you shift over to the supply chain or producer cooperatives, which I think this actually aligns with, is like Ocean Spray, for an example. Like all the different farmers, they get, through Ocean Spray, they're able to collectivize and more effectively market Ocean Spray, but it is a cooperative behind it. And similarly here, this in many ways is sort of a blend of user and consumer, producer and user cooperatives, and that they can use it, but they're also producing the different elements. And through the cooperative, they're getting more, I guess, pricing power or power or the ability to influence or integrate through that cooperative.
Totally agreed. So of course, we, as we said earlier, when it comes to private data, stuff must be very subjective. So it is not that the co-op can influence heavily how the data behavior of data subjects will be. You can do every decision on your own. Of course, the co-op is offering mechanisms to make that easier for you, so to automate trust decisions and all these things. But if you want to, you can ignore everything what is besides the code. Of course, you have to use the code, but all the preferences, all the systems which are helping, you can ignore them completely and do everything on your own if you want to. So, but being a member in that co-op means you can make decisions. And one important aspect, and I guess it's the same in the US and in Europe, is these one head, one vote. So it doesn't matter how many shares you're buying. Of course, as more shares you have, as larger incentive is. But when it comes to decision making, we are all equal. And because you raised that already a little bit earlier, how the economic model is then here with the co-op. So 98% of the money that is generated in the transactions between corporates and users is going directly to the user, even if he's not a member. So the largest extent is going directly to the data subject. So 2% as a kind of a transaction fee. Half of it is going to the enterprise and half of it is going to the co-op. And the co-op is then consuming the money needed to support the organization, the further development, and so on and so forth. And the rest of the money is then going to the members. So end of the day, you can say most of the money is going directly to the user. And what is not needed for supporting that infrastructure and to develop it further is also going to the users, but then only to the ones which are members, because we want to reward that people were willing to give some money to that kind of project, which is a risk. We are a startup, maybe an untypical one, but nevertheless, we are a startup. So you're risking something if you're investing your money. And so there must be a reward for that. And that's basically then paid out of that 1%.
Right. Well, I completely agree with, even if you're trying to achieve the common good, it has to be sustainable.
Yes. We are not a charity.
If you're not sustainable, then you don't achieve the common good. And so you talked a bit about the local community aspect of it. What about the underlying code for the project? Where is that managed? Is there an open component to it, or is it closed source?
No, it's fully open source, 100%, not only 99. No, it's 100% open source. It's currently at Git. I guess we will stay with Git for a while at least. So everything what we are doing is published there. We have a network out of universities and people who are working with us together. So the project currently is, say, everything what you can see in Git is something we made publicly available already. So all the stuff we are working on, which will come in the, let me say, next 6 or 12 months, will be again fully open sourced, but we will open source it as soon as we are happy with the quality of it. So that will change over time, because in the moment, because we are really at the beginning of that whole thing, we are not only building the underlying infrastructure, we are also building, say, use cases, like, for example, the importers for Facebook and Google and whatsoever. So in an ideal world, companies like Facebook or Google would build that kind of features on their own to hand over the data back to their customers. We have companies who are willing to do so. We're currently talking to them, training them how to build these kind of things. But as I said, in the moment, it's really us who are building the infrastructure and the cases on top of it. But in the near future, we will just take care of the underlying infrastructure, and the community can then build features on top of it. So it can be integrated in other apps. It can be via SDKs. You can use that kind of technology really as a tech stack to build complete apps. It is running currently only on mobiles, but we have versions which are running on laptops, on Apple TV, but also on a Raspberry Pi or inside of a car. Sooner or later, we will publish all these things so that we have really solid infrastructure which can be used by others to make.
And so now getting to the Polypod, I guess, mobile, maybe just a breakdown of its features. Clearly, there's a computational aspect. There's an aspect of it that whereby you receive the algorithms. But I've also heard you talk a little bit about the configurability of the user's interaction with the algorithm or selection of which algorithms are permitted or which entities or how its data is being shared pursuant to those algorithms. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that?
Of course. If an algorithm is coming to my device, I must be able to make a good decision. Do I really want to let that beast in? So, if you're going back to the real world, that would mean I will let something into my head. And that's frightening, or that something is going into my private sphere and using something there. So we have to enable people to make decisions on that one. I guess that's one of the biggest problems in the moment in the data economy or in the whole digital economy, that people are not empowered. And when we are talking about empowering, we don't mean that somebody has to do half size of a computer study or computer science degree before he is able to use a chat client or whatsoever. So the problem is not that people are too stupid. The problem is that our systems are crap. They are too far away from how reality works. And for example, if you just think about how trust is working in reality, trust in reality works highly subjective, very, very dynamic. And, it is more that it's not a 0 or 1 thing. I guess that there's not a single person in the world you would trust 100%, and there's not a single person in the world you would trust 0%. It is something in between. So, but if you look in the digital world, we are currently using that SSL certificate here for encrypting our communication. So the certificate was created by somebody I've never heard about. And I'm 100% sure that 99.999% of the people have never heard about that company as well. And it is definitely not context sensitive. It is definitely, so trust in the digital world works exactly in the opposite way how it works in the real world. So how should people able to make good decisions when the systems are using the same terms but acting completely differently? We had a researcher really at the beginning of Polypoly. He was researching on social aspects and so on and so forth. And he said, friendship is a little bit like Cold War. So I was like, what? No, that cannot be. He said, yes, but if you have a really good friend, you are handing over details about you. And, if this person would misuse that kind of information, he can bring it down to your knees. So in exchange, these these good friends would hand over the same kind of details to you, so that you have, you're on eye level again. So, both have enough nuclear weapons to, to destroy both sides. And that's the way how friendship is working in some way. Yeah, we are always on the same level. So, how many intimate details do you know about Mr. Zuckerberg? He knows a lot about you, but what do we know about him? Don't get me wrong, I'm not really interested in his details, but as you can see here, we have a system which is working exactly the opposite way than it works in reality. Here in the digital world, we have a totally unbalanced system, and in the real world, we have a balanced system. So that means, for example, we have created something which is called trust patterns. So companies or organizations or individuals can publish whom they are trusting. So an NGO, for example, who is really deep into data privacy and computation things and whatsoever, they can check out algorithms and they can say, hey, that's a good one. We trust that company and we're trusting that algorithm. Other NGOs or maybe good friends who know something about a dedicated aspect can do the same thing. Or they can also say, we don't trust them. Yeah. So you as an individual, you can decide which kind of trust patterns are you subscribing. For example, the co-op is offering a trust pattern. You can subscribe it or you can say no. So if so, then the decisions, if you're accepting an algorithm or not, is based on three elements. The first element is your preference. We are not all the same. So some people are more open to the world. Others are more saying, okay, let me wait for a second. Then we have the influence from the outside. These are these trust patterns, what we are subscribing for others. And then the very most important part is your transactional history. So if your friend was, you have a good friend for 2-3 decades, and somebody's coming across and saying, hey, he's a total idiot, he's lying, blah, 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 blah. You would say, hey, what are you saying? I know that guy for 3 decades. He was always nice to me and whatsoever. So, your personal experience with somebody, also with a company, is the most important part. As longer your history of successful transaction with somebody is privately or with a company, as stronger your relationship is, and as more you're accepting, or more or less automatically. It depends a little bit on the sensibility level of your data, which is used for the calculation or for the transaction. But that is in general how that works. So the second part, which is coming into the game here, is the sensibility of data, and I'm talking about this every single data entry. So a picture of you in front of your house is not as sensible than a picture of you fully drunk and half naked after a party. When somebody wants to use these pictures, the sensibility level is much higher. So that means, your polypod would say, hey, that means you really have to have a deep trust or a strong trust level to that dedicated person. And in for some data, nobody would ever get access to that one. So that is making that whole stuff a little bit easier to understand what kind of data will be used, what kind of data will be sent back, and for what reason somebody is sending an algorithm. There is also some other aspect, but maybe that's going too much into detail. If you want to, we can deep dive. We can make a deep dive here, but totally up to you.
When we talk about the algorithms, when we talk about the capability of even sharing that computational power, which I find, the notion of like the transactions can be highly individualized, meaning like I don't necessarily need to know that I'm part of a community that's agreeing to it. I can just make my own decisions. In other contexts, I may actually value the decisions of the group, meaning, there's a validation. Like somebody who I don't know is coming to me and saying, I'd like to use your data. It's like, okay, I know Google, but I wouldn't be giving my data to Google, but I don't understand Thorstens, common good initiative, as it's called, right? I want to know more about it. So I join a community, and that's where I co-sign on it, right? And then I can submit. And then but when you start thinking of it in like sort of like when people are more active and maybe they're setting their frameworks for saying, I want to engage in this community, like, I know that Thorstens common good initiative integrates with a bunch of companies, and I know he always uses this way of vetting those companies' use of the data. So in other words, to your point, exactly to your point, like I have a one-on-one trust basis with you. I know that you're going to deploy the standard. You can almost agree for me. I have that much confidence in the terms of the companies, but but maybe Monica, I just chose Monica out of thin air.
Yeah.
No offense to Monica,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
maybe Monica, sometimes I want to do it. Sometimes I don't want to do it because, she likes, doing like, stuff in North Korea or crazy jurisdictions.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't want to be part of that one. Right. So, and so then when I co-sign on yours, but now that sort of puts you in a position of saying, I can, like, maybe one model is to sort of think, okay, how do we engage more dynamically with a multitude of different companies, but also deploy, like, for computational power as a community, but also ensure that we're deploying the requisite privacy enhancing technologies. I'm thinking, I don't know, off the top of my head, multi-party computation would seem to be a particularly compelling use, although, I don't know about the computational load on a device basis, on a local device. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So let us go again. That's one of our typical patterns. Before we are making system decisions, we are always going back to real world and think about, how was that made before we had computers? Because, we have a working society for quite some long time. Of course, we had also some trouble with our societies here and there. But in general, we are quite a successful species. The first thing we have to understand here is what we are calling facets. So we are currently talking to each other and we are showing one face to the other. But this is not me. It is just one aspect of me. And it is the aspect I want to show you. So you can never be sure if I'm lying or not, but that's normal. Whenever people are getting in touch first, in a real world, they're creating a kind of a facade, saying, hey, that's the face I want to show you. The face I'm showing to my mom is a different one. The face I'm showing to my wife is a different one, and so on and so forth. So that's something we are trained in. So we as humans, we are really good in, creating a social context. And for these social contexts, we are creating one personality we are willing to share. So first of all, that means you would never be able to subscribe my trust patterns. You would just be able to subscribe the trust patterns of the aspect I'm willing to show you. So if I have aspects in my life I'm not sharing with you because they are very, very private for me and we are not good friends for decades or not family members, there are aspects you would never be able to see. And you would also not be able to subscribe these kind of trust patterns. So that means, in case of Monica, if Monica is doing something and that's something you like and that's something you're getting in touch with, and you don't know what Monica is doing in Korea or whatsoever, that doesn't matter for you because you're just taking care of this aspect of Monica. In this aspect, what she's doing is good. It's good for you from your point of view. So okay, you can just subscribe your trust patterns. So as I said, this influence from the outside is just one of these three aspects. So, even if Monica is running crazy right now, in these aspects you have subscribed, then these will influence you only a bit. First of all, you maybe have other people, you're talking with, and you're connected with, and you have subscribed their trust patterns as well. So then all together, their trust patterns are building these aspects of trust for that dedicated decision. And the rest is privately based or personally for you. So then, of course, nevertheless, let's take the example. You have subscribed my trust patterns and you trust me really, really a lot. And then for whatever reason, I'm running crazy, fully. So what would happen in the real world? First of all, if you're sitting in a cafe, you're talking to somebody and lots of people are sitting around you, you're getting loud. You start shouting. Then the others would look at you and say, oh, what's going on there? And that normally means, you're reducing your noise level, because you're feeling the eyes of the others. You feel that there's something not okay in that context. So we call that a polypod get get hot. So it behaves differently than the day before. And so what that normally means is that the rest of the pods are getting a little bit nervous. They're saying, okay, hey, what's going on there? For example, it could be that you get hacked, and somebody's trying to misuse your pod. So if your normal behavior is changing, it's not that the connection will be cut or so. It is just that what's coming from you is taken with let me say, not really seriously for a while. And it's also that the pod is then interacting with you as a user, saying, hey, you have subscribed or something from that dude, and it looks like that this dude is acting unexpectedly. Do you still want
how
to
would you
use
detect that?
Trust? There are several ways. Yeah, there are several ways. And just to make that crystal clear, that is not all implemented in the moment. We are still doing research on that one. And it's a very, very tricky thing. But
I can imagine.
As I said, we are a startup. Unfortunately, we cannot do everything at once. We have so much things we would love to do tomorrow, but step by step. So
I hear you.
One way is to detect, and that has to do with hacking prevention and so on and so forth. If pod is start communicating from an unexpected area. So of course that can mean you are on vacation, but that you take your phone to Hawaii or whatsoever. But when the communication is coming from a different point, that's the first indicator for the other pod to say, okay, let us see what's going on. If the pod is then still acting like normally. So then the second thing is the interval of communication. So normally a pod is in some way, don't get me wrong on that one, in some way your digital twin. So it is in some way acting a little bit like you. Yeah, don't take that too serious, that statement. But there's a pattern of communication which is typical for your pod. If these interval of communication, so for example, in the last 10 years or 5 years, you have just communicated with me once a week, and now I'm getting pings from your pod every 10 seconds. That feels weird. That just going back in reality, you have somebody you have not heard about for a year, but then he's giving you a call every hour. You would say, hey, what's going on there? And so stuff like that. There are also other things. We are currently talking to some security experts to help us to detect that kind of uncommon behavior and patterns, to detect that kind of stuff. It's also, for example, what kind of data somebody is sending or asking for. Normally we have patterns, we are quite, let me say, in our normal life, we are quite rational, or rational is maybe not the right word, but we are acting similar all the time. Yeah. So we are asking for the same things. We are sharing the same things. And by the way, it feels also good to have these kind of, people around yourself, because there's a lot of uncertainty outside in the world, to have a certain community which is acting always the same. That feels good for us as humans. So if something is changing dramatically, in our normal life, we would recognize it immediately, and we are just trying to rebuild that in our pod, because then you can make good gut decisions. Most of the time we are making gut decisions. Is somebody really reading all these terms of conditions? No, of course not. Just scrolling through, press OK. Yeah. So we have to build a system which you can use, say with the oldest part of your brain, instead of being always conscious and thinking about, oh, is it right or wrong? And yeah. So otherwise nobody would use it.
You raise a very interesting point, which is, I'm sort of thinking ahead, because as you become better at identifying the patterns for your users' engagement, and you get more users, that data itself both presents an opportunity and potentially a problem. The opportunity is that, to become the most effective at what you're doing in terms of even just who's responding in what ways to what privacy disclosures. There may be, again, this sort of gets to, like, if I'm a member of Polypoly, I've done some of my research, but I really don't want to do all of it. And I want to trust people, or I want to, I only want to know so much.
Yeah.
The rest I want to be lazy about because I don't have time.
Yeah.
And so you could call it machine learning over time, or basically some automated way of learning these patterns and implementing them into the system could be extremely powerful. On the flip side, as you deploy these systems to collect this data, that data itself becomes private data.
Right.
And so
Of course. And that's the reason why this is also fully decentralized. We don't get that data. We don't want to have it. We have a web server for our website. That's all.
But I guess the question is, and I guess this is where privacy enhancing technologies come in, or because you do have an interest in collectivizing this data and analyzing this data, but that interest is in a very secure way. So on some level, you could deploy expansive machine learning algorithms over time to the extent it makes
Of
it
course.
more effective for your users.
Of course.
And then, if you're using like secure multi-party computation where, you are consuming it, but it is fully encrypted, and then that could feed the algorithm, but the data resides in the user's platform.
Yes.
The metadata isn't, it's all encrypted. Then presumably you've hit sort of there's no holy grail, but you sort of hit an optimal use case where you are consuming the data in a fully encrypted, protected, privacy-preserving manner in a way that enhances the privacy of all the constituent members.
Yeah. So let us distinguish here between two things. One is what I would call a personal AI. So that means an AI which only needs my own data to get trained. Yeah. So not the data of any other person, only the data which is stored. To be more precise, only the data which is stored in my pod. That can also be other people's data if they have, for example, shared pictures with me or whatsoever. So that is running on your own devices and only on your own devices, and nothing what will happen there will be shared with anybody if you don't want to. So, and that don't has to be encrypted. Of course, it is encrypted on the device because, our computation array is encrypted and so on and so forth. But here you're not really running into that problem because you just need what is on my device already. So that is, for example, a system that can help you a lot to make decisions easier and so on and so forth, highly personalized. So then we are coming to the other problem. What is when the data of a lot of people is needed? So when you can only train a model when lots of people are working together to train that model. So, for example, to calculate the best schedule of your public transportation system in your hometown, then all the citizens, the visitors, should work together, using their calendars and their daily habits to say, hey, that would be the best plan for our public transport. So, how we are doing so? That's something what we are calling federated AI. So that you're putting an untrained model in the infrastructure, let me say. And then, especially during night, when, because in these dedicated cases, it's not time critical, you can do that during night, when all the devices are idling and plugged in to your power supply, they're downloading the untrained model, training it locally, and then not handing it over directly to the infrastructure. No, you're handing it over to the next person you're very familiar with. So, for example, you will hand it over to your brother. And, your brother will train it. And these one will hand it over to, your uncle and da. So before this model is going back to the infrastructure, it was already handed over to a lot of people so that it is really, really difficult to recalculate individual data out of that. And it is not, handed over to somebody you don't know who's maybe trying to tweak that system. No, it will be handed over to somebody you trust. And we have that network theory saying, hey, with around 7 corners we know everybody. So that means by handing it over from one to the other, and along that trusted network, you can minimize the potential threat. You cannot completely eliminate it, and let us be honest here, also encryption cannot do. Whenever something, when we're speaking stuff out loud, it's out of our mouths. We cannot put it back into our mouths. So, if as soon as I'm sending out data or putting insights of my data into a foreign system, it's out of my control. We can just make sure, and we can do we cannot make sure, we can do our best, make it as secure as possible. But we would always warn, depends of course on the automation level of a user, we should always warn the user saying, hey, if you're participating on that one, this is leaving your private sphere, and the chance that these can be recalculated back to you will be like da. Yeah. So, but because you maybe trust that person a lot who's asking for that data, you would say, okay, I'm willing to do so. So there is a community we are working with together called Open Mind. It is a really beautiful project and lots of smart people in there. I really like them a lot. And so we are currently Federated AI and Federated Big Data is a little bit down the road for us, round about, say, mid to end of the year. First of all, we want to build all the download functionalities so that people can see what the net knows about them. And then we are building that stuff as well. Yeah, they are doing really awesome stuff, and they're helping us to build these federated AI system, federated big data stuff.
Going back to the onboarding of the companies, I guess, do companies that engage with Polypod users, how are they, is it an automatic vetting? Is it basically Polypod is just something like you don't necessarily, is it that you don't choose the community of the companies, but they just have to adhere to certain, the preferences set by the user, or do they have to be almost pre-vetted in order for Polypod users to share data with them?
No. Everybody can join that community. Really, everybody. We have to be fully market neutral. That's from our point of view an absolutely necessary prerequisite for an infrastructure. Ford is as allowed as General Motors to use your streets. But nevertheless, and I guess even Mercedes-Benz is allowed to use American streets. But nevertheless, there are some regulations, and these, in our case, that's of course not laws. So as I said, everybody. Really, every kind of company, every kind of human being can use the Polypod. We would never keep somebody out, but we will have an opinion about some, let me say, actions companies are doing. So I don't know if you want to deep dive there, but we are running one other system which is called Polypedia, and Polypedia is what we would call the Bloomberg of the data economy. So we have bought the company house data of thousands of companies that was necessary to define their jurisdiction. So if a Polypod user, for example, wants to delete some data, then we need to know in which jurisdiction that company is settled. So what are the period of time they have to delete it, and so on and so forth. So for that reason, we bought all that company house data. And then beside of that, we are collecting their information about their data behavior. So, what kind of data they are collecting, what kind of apps they are running, what kind of website they are running, to whom they are sharing data, and so on and so forth. And so when somebody is getting in touch with you, and it is a company, you as a user, it's your decision if you want to work with them together. What we are offering to you is first of all saying, hey, this company is settled in, I don't know, Germany, Ireland, US, whatsoever. They are collecting that kind of data, and they are sharing that kind of data for that purposes with da. So you will see precisely, as precise as we can, and understandable what will happen with your data. And of course, what we are also collecting, and we have some supporters in the, let me say, community who are, for example, checking what the apps are really doing, not what the companies are saying what they are doing, what they are really doing. And if there's a difference, we also say that clearly. Say, hey, that is what, this chat client is saying what he's doing. And that is what the community found out what it is doing. Totally up to you to make your own mind on that. So, and then by doing so, you're getting a first idea to whom you're talking there. And so and we are also offering an interface for corporates that they can support their own information in our system. But we are also offering an interface to journalists and NGOs and whatsoever that they can say, hey, what these companies saying is a lie.
So we had a little sound break, I guess, there, but I wanted to follow up on a couple of points.
Please.
If a user has certain preferences for engaging with a company, I guess if the company can't demonstrate that it can meet those preferences, then they just simply won't share data with that company. And then the user community who checks up on it, let's say that the company says, I do everything that you want me to with your data. We are the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts of data privacy. And your community is engaging with them. And then somebody does a research project and says, no, they're not the Girl Scouts. They're selling it to hackers in, top hackers in all the countries. Is there an update at that point? Like, in other words, I guess I'm asking is like, is there a blacklisting or something like that?
Yes. Yeah, it's a real-time system. We don't need any software.
They would be blacklisted?
Blacklisted from your personal point of view, not in general.
Right.
So if other people would say, hey, I give a shit for it, they are selling my data to blah, 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 they can still work together. It's not up to us to say what's right and wrong. We will just make transparent what's true. What does that mean to you? It's your decision. Also, there can be companies who need much more data than other would need. I don't know. We're currently talking, for example, to a company which is a large car sharing provider. They would like to get access to very, very to a large amount of data because they want to calculate as precise as possible when a car should be where. So they would like to have access to your calendar and whatsoever. So would I be willing to share my calendar with a company? Of course not. But I can understand that they would need that kind of information. So what is the solution? Say, hey, very simple. Send me the algorithm. Or in this case, let us build a federated AI system, which is training the model every night, so that in the morning when we are standing up, the cars are at the right place. Or you're currently talking to a company who is in the fashion industry, and they want to change their way of producing dresses for environmental protection reasons. By the way, they said, hey, we want to stop producing stuff which is then just hanging around in a shop and fits more or less. We would like to change that in a way that these dresses are produced when you are ordering them and personally measured. So that would mean they will need more or less a digital version of your body. That means you have to stand in your home making photos of yourself half naked. That's quite a high fashion label. Can you imagine what would happen if they would get hacked and millions of managers would be published half naked? So don't get me wrong, most of them I even don't want to see half naked, but that would be a disaster for that company. So what is the solution? Very simple. Send me the algorithm to my device, and what you're getting back is not my photos. What you're getting back is a wireframe. Yeah, you just need a model of my body, which is good enough to build my these individual or bespoke dresses, but you don't need my picture. So it is in the interest of that company to really change, sending the algorithm. They don't want to have that pictures. By the way, same with this car sharing company. They said, hey, the CTO told me, he said, I cannot sleep well anymore. I said, because when somebody is going to a, let me say, special meeting, he don't want to use his own car for. They're using ours. They're not using an Uber. They're not using a taxi. They're using car sharing cars. When these data would get hacked and be published, that would be our end. And so lots of companies are really willing to give all that data back because it makes their life much easier and cheaper.
Yes. Yeah, no, and that's something that's very powerful about the platform that isn't to be understated, which is, data is toxic. If you're a responsible company,
Yes.
personal identifiable information is toxic. I think Dan Bogdanoff says it's the new nuclear waste. And so as a CTO, like you have all this data, you get hacked. Yeah. If you can discover a way not to have this data, like you can, and to your point, like why do you want the pictures of somebody half naked? The only reason why you want the picture of somebody half naked is to figure out from a modeling perspective what to do with it. So something that gives you that model without all the burden of the data protection makes your life a hell of a lot easier. Like the best way to protect yourself against hacks is not to have the information that the hackers would want, or the inadvertent disclosure is not to have the information. So that's powerful. And I think it answers my question also in that the fundamental objective is the data minimization to identify what data is coming back. So in the case of selling data to the hackers, listen, I could take this example to an extreme, right? Meaning my profile is, because it's the Girl Scouts of America, I love them, and I will show everything about myself to them, whereas somebody else or some other entity, I won't. And then, but then something changes where the hackers are actually buying it, and somebody in the community discovers it. I guess my question was, and you answered the more important question, honestly, and sort of because I think it's like it's an extreme. It's more of an extreme, but why not? We're going down this road.
Yeah.
So once it's discovered that these people are, we'll stay with the fashion industry, that it's actually being sold, instead of it going to the Girl Scouts, it's being sold to pornography hackers. I don't even know there's such a thing, but we'll just go there.
Yeah.
If that gets discovered, how, as a user who's opened myself up, who have no idea, I say, listen, just for these guys, I hate the idea of anybody else seeing me half naked, but because it's the Girl Scouts, I trust them totally. What changes in that? Like, is that even a logical use case? Is it sort of like, Eric, that doesn't even exist? But you tell me, like, how does that get, as a user, something changes not in the way that the company portrays itself to the polypod, but something changes to the credibility of that. How does the polypod itself react to it?
Of course, and if nobody is recognizing this, nothing will happen. So, but there are smart people out there. There is a community out there, journalists whatsoever. So you can, or there are organizations. I don't know how the one is called. I don't remember the name. There's an organization in the US. I guess it's called Customer Report or something like that, which is constantly monitoring products and publishing reports about it. Well, I don't remember the name. What was the name of it? Can you help me?
Consumer Reports.
Consumer Reports, that was it. Yeah. So it would be lovely if they would publish their trust pattern. So if they would join the Polypoly system, like other NGOs or unions or political parties or newspapers or whatsoever, churches, I don't know, and they publish their trust pattern, and it's up to you to decide, okay, I'm trusting these, I'm subscribing these trust pattern. And so, for example, if this is the New York Times and the New York Times is reporting, hey, these company have made something horrible, that will have immediately an influence on your decision because it's a real-time connection. They're changing their trust pattern. You have subscribed it. They're saying, okay, we decrease the trust in that company massively. Then you will get a ping. If it is really something massively and you have a strong connection to New York Times, you will get informed proactively saying, hey, something changed here. Do you want to read that article about it? And then we will just bring you to that to that newspaper and you can read it and then you can make a decision. Or you can say, hey, if just one party is saying something is going wrong there, I don't care. But as soon as let me say 5, 6, 7 or very, very important ones are all saying, hey, something is wrong here, then your pod is getting aware about it and saying, hey, okay, now I have to act. But it is exactly how it works in reality. And because everything is subjective here, we don't have these typical, and when we're talking about hate speech and all that things, it's not so much about echo chambers. We are in echo chambers for hundreds of years already. So it is about the algorithms which are pushing up things which are as loud as possible, and also, let me say, creating reach in an unnormal way. So that's not happening in our system. By the way, you can also change the algorithms of how this whole stuff is calculated. As I said, it is an open platform and people can just publish another algorithm and you can download it to your pod and then you're using that one. But the algorithm we are trying to use is as close to normal human behavior. And it will take a while for us also to optimize it really in that way. That doesn't make everything perfect. Don't get me wrong. We had problems in our society before, but at least it is then in the way how it was before. So we can deal with it with the mechanisms we have learned over the last thousands of years. And not completely unexpected.
So I think you gave me the right answer. So having been in a similar position myself at one time, I know the danger of feature creep. Somebody says, wouldn't it be great if, and wouldn't it be great if, and I'm sure in your position, particularly when it's a cooperative, wouldn't it be great if you could do every single thing perfectly? Yeah, it would, but it would take us forever and we wouldn't prioritize and we wouldn't even get off the ground. And so I think what you're saying, it's an important point too, which is if you're a Polypoly user, you still have the power to screw up your trust profile.
Totally.
You try to give the tools, but if you say, listen, Girl Scouts of America, half naked's fine, you'll be, Polypoly allows you to say, okay, whatever. I mean, I'm not even saying that it's half naked, but whatever, it might just be like whatever I share, and there's no controls but Polypoly's not going to if something, it doesn't have like a news feed or something that automatically, even if somebody in the group realizes it, blacklist it, you're still there could be a whole community that recognizes it. But if you're one of these people who don't engage, who don't inform, you could still be despite the fact that you have Polypoly, you could still be exposed. And so Polypoly gives you the tools, but it gives you the freedom, but that freedom could also be, you may not be educated enough. That freedom should also be, it's not just a blind reliance, like, oh, I'm on Polypoly, so I'm all good. I know I'm never going to be, my information is never going to be, exposed. I can give all my information to Girl Scouts of America, and there's nothing that'll happen wrong. You still have that obligation. I'm assuming that there's probably also, I'm guessing if you have an active community and people are like, hey, I just realized that the Girl Scouts of America are associating with, I mean, this is just such a ridiculous example, but they're associating with the pornography hackers of North Korea. I keep picking on North Korea or some other jurisdiction,
whatever.
Then you could, that's like an information stream, and you could say, hey, I'm part of a community that identified this and I'll change it, but it doesn't, you still have to be responsible, and you can be responsible by setting those controls maybe a little stricter, but if you choose to loosen it up, you're responsible for that too. So it's free will, and that's what it should be. And building every single scenario into it is probably not going to lead, because the other problem with feature creep is it's also to your point, you were saying it before, it has to be easy. Right? The interface, you could build all this functionality, but if the users don't know how to use it or they screw it up, it has to be kind of goof proof, then it's not going to be adopted. And then I guess another question I had, because you were talking about the Polypedia. Polypedia is an informational source. And so let's say that I want to pursue data deletion. Let's say that, and again, I mean, this also probably falls into the bucket of being all things to all people, but if I want to do it, contact a company and have my data deleted, are there tools for that outside of Polypedia which advises, informs me of that policy?
Yeah, so there are, of course, lots of communities out there who are trying to deal with that problem. So most of them, and I'm not saying that this is wrong, I'm just saying that most of them are more on a research level and so on and so forth. So that means most of these things would help people who are in their topic already. Yeah. So, but for, how are you calling it in America, Joe Doe or something like that, typical dude.
John Doe.
That doesn't help.
Yeah.
John Doe, thanks. That doesn't really help. I guess that's a typical problem we had in that whole space over the last decades. Things like PGP and so on and so forth. We had awesome tools, technically perfect, but really difficult to use for people who are not in that tech space. Yeah. So would my mom be able to install such a kind of thing on her iPhone? I would say no. She would already fail or at least stumble a bit when she would try to read what the thing is good for. So what we will build, first of all, as I said, what we are currently building is that you can download all your data. That is an important step for you as a citizen, because then you will know what the net knows about you. And it is an important step for us as an ecosystem, because it is importing data capital to this ecosystem. If you're utilizing it or not is a different story, but it is importing data capital to that ecosystem, means to your own devices. So then you can say, okay, now I want to clean up what the net knows about me, because I maybe found something here and there. Each feature, by the way, normally, so for example, if you're downloading your Facebook data or your Google data or whatsoever, this is normally generating hints to other data sources. You're finding hints. Oh, it looks like that some of the data is also at Instagram. Okay, and from there you're coming to, I don't know, whatever, Hotmail and so on and so forth. And so you're collecting more and more of your data, and then you find stuff. You say, hey, that picture should be on my device, but nowhere else. I want to vanish that from the net. And because the Polypod will remember where this picture is all stored, you can generate a message saying, okay, automatically to all these data consumers, and saying, hey, please delete that. Then it will connect the Polypedia to find out where are these companies are settled. And then it will check after 2-4 weeks, whatsoever, depends on the jurisdiction, reinitiating a data downloads and having a look if the picture is still in there. If so, you can, depending on your local law, you can punish these companies, or you can force them to delete that. So what we will build for Europe soonish is a fully or nearly a highly automatic legal pipeline, so that a company doesn't behave well and by the way, also an American company, if they don't behave well in Europe, that the European customer can fully automatically send that to lawyers. They will take care of it, and so on and so forth. So this is a beast of work to do. And unfortunately, that's something you have to redo again and again, depending on the jurisdiction. You see, there the co-ops are coming into the game again. So as soon as we have an American co-op, these co-op will take care of implementing the legal pipeline for the American market. And so because we currently have just a co-op in Europe, we will do that for Europe in a moment. But yes, you can delete that stuff. You know, deleting it is quite easy in the meaning of sending out notifications to these companies. But if they don't behave well, to really force them, and you know, a right you cannot execute is not a right. Yeah? So means you need an execution here, and it must be an easy one and a cheap one for the consumer. Otherwise, nothing will change. But that will take a while, I guess, before we will have that in the US, because first we will need the co-op in the US.
Right. And then I think Max Schrems's organization, what's it, Neue? Is that, they're very active.
Lovely thing.
They're very active in that space. Yeah.
Yeah. They're doing really cool stuff in Austria. There are projects like the one of Max who are, you know, digging deep into you know, the terms of conditions and so on and so forth. Companies, they are checking out stuff, and basically we are building these infrastructure also to support folks like that. Because the funny thing is that happened to one of their, we are generating constantly data downloads from you know, Facebook and others, and from time to time it happens that some data type, I'm not saying data, really data type, is appearing in one data download of the same company that was never there before, and it disappearing afterwards again. So basically, they by excuse, they have exposed that they have more data about somebody than ever before. So what all the polypods are doing is they're spying back. They're checking what is coming. So they're spying back what the companies are sending to them. And as soon as a new data type is in there, they will inform the polypedia, hey, here's a new data type. Not, you know, they're not sending your data. They're just saying, oh, it looks like that Netflix is also storing when I stop the movie and, you know, reward and, you know, fast forward and whatsoever, and, you know, something like that. So then the polypedia will know. And that means as well, the next polypod, a few minutes later, will also ask for that data and say, hey, we know that you have that data, so hand it out. Give it to me. And so the coverage of their data per company is getting better and better over time.
Right. And by the way, the organization was not Neue, it's Neub. They're doing things that no one else is doing in Europe. You know, they're going after, they're complaining in jurisdictions, they're understanding the legal system that the GDPR affords them to go after companies that are not complying. And they got quite a plate, but you know, as you said, it's like, what's the point of GDPR if there isn't any type of enforcement mechanism if you don't comply? And Neub is ensuring or endeavoring to ensure, they got their work cut out for them, but they're very active in that front. How do you view the changing burdens, the changing expenses for security at the more centralized level? Like like you said, you were talking to security providers. How do you think about security as this scales?
So I guess first of all, we have to understand that hacking is normally an economic process. There are, of course, hackers with they have other reasons, but most of the time it's they're doing so for earning money. And so that means one of the best things you can do to get rid of hackers is to make it not worthwhile anymore. So, you know, that the amount of data you can get by hacking somebody is so low that it doesn't make sense anymore. So, you know, again, let us go back into reality. You know, when I'm checking my front door, it has a simple key locker. In comparison, especially to my bank. You know, when I'm going to my bank, the key locker is definitely a different one. So by decentralizing data, you know, Of course, the polypod is not unhackable. Of course not. But does it really make sense to hack me? Yeah, you can hack me. I'm not a so interesting person. Like, for most of the people, that's true. Would we recommend to use a polypod when you're the president of the United States or the chancellor of Germany or a journalist in a horrible country? No, please not. The polypod we are actually building is for normal people. They're not built for. It's not built for people with a special security requirement. Later, we will publish the specification of the pod, and then NGOs who are specialized on that one, or governments who want to build a polypod for politicians, they can do so. It's not our job. Our job is to say to make the life of the people out there easier and not saving the life of a journalist. Don't get me wrong. I would love to do so, but I cannot fix all the problems at once. So
right. Scope creep.
And yes, unfortunately. And so that means, by draining all these honeypots and bringing that stuff back to us, we will fix a lot of hacking issues as a side effect, and not by technology, by a systematic approach, more or less. It's a little bit like, does it make sense to break into your bank if the money is not there? No, it only makes sense if all the money is stored there. So, but if all the data is stored in my pocket, yes, you can break into my pod, and then you know that I'm, I don't know, a fan of Big Bang Theory or whatsoever, if you want to, or you can maybe also see what my body index is. If you're interested in that, hey, I'm sorry for you that you are interested in my body index. Your life must be really boring. So, and then I guess that's the good thing. When we're getting rid of all these kind of hacking, we will get, just the rest of the stuff will stay there. And then our governments and our NGOs can take care of these really bad asses, which are there trying to harm our society. Because, all these economic or business hacking, often that happens, people are breaking into systems to get maybe, I don't know, the private telephone number of Angela Merkel. And they're not interested in my one. They are just grabbing all that stuff. And because some whips are in that data pool as well, they're trying to break in. Okay. And then that doesn't make sense anymore then. If all that stuff is just, in our private pods, problem solved, partly. But then we can start taking care of the real big problems, and not of these vandalism, let me say. But that's the way how we can help there at least a bit. And just to make it also crystal clear here, we are not saying we should generate less data. No, we should generate even more data, because as more data we have, and when we are saying we, that means me personally, as much better we can optimize things. We can make better recommendations. Or to be precise, recommendation engines can work better on that infrastructure based on your data, making you locally a recommendation. We can produce better products
based on relevant data.
Energy. Yes. Clean data. There's a study out there which is saying 85% of all the data these companies are stored as so-called rot data, so redundant, obsolete, trivial, and outdated. When I got it right. Just imagine how many money these companies are burning by saving all that data, how many energy is consumed to save all that data, and how many poor data scientists are sitting in front of all this useless data and have to generate something meaningful out of that for the next board meeting. Let us get rid of all that shit and let us focus on the stuff that's real. And by decentralizing things, stuff getting a context, and context makes things clearer.
Well, great. That's a great note to end the podcast. We're over time. I actually feel like we could probably go for hours. I'm a bit of a nerd, so I don't know. My hours may not appeal to everybody, but this was a great session.
Thanks.
I look forward to following up and keeping tabs on Polypoly, because it hits a lot of my points, a lot of things that I'm thinking about and on the encrypted economy and otherwise. So So Thorsten, thank you. It was wonderful to have you on the podcast, and we'll be keeping tabs.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for your time. Hopefully, it is also interesting for your audience what we talked about. And yeah, whenever I can help, just give me a ping. And as soon as we are opening their co-op in the US, yeah, you will get a notification for sure. And by the way, that was funny from a European perspective. It looks like the best co-op law we found is in Texas, not in California. And I guess because of the farmers. So we are in contact with a lawyer down there, and hey, that's awesome what they have there in Texas. We will see.
So it's interesting. I'm actually doing a jurisdictional analysis across jurisdictions. Texas is one of the ones I have to return to. I spend a lot of time focusing on Colorado because it aligns well with the crypto space. I've also heard great things about Minnesota, but Texas got on my calendar, on my list, and I actually, this weekend was the weekend I'm looking at Texas. Another one that amazed me was Washington D.C. of all places.
Oh, really?
They have because what's interesting in D.C. is you don't even have to form an entity. It's basically an unincorporated cooperative association, and that's. I know of unincorporated nonprofits. I didn't know of unincorporated cooperative associations. I think it's really probably an outgrowth of the lobbying and quasi-lobbying groups in Washington, D.C. But anyway.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff. But now you got me thinking Texas. I'm thinking Texas, like this weekend's Texas for me.
Yeah. So, there's an awesome university in Spain, which is funded by one of the largest cooperatives in Europe, and I guess they are one of the largest in the world. So they have their own university, and we are currently working with them together on building a kind of a blue book, how to build co-ops in different parts of the world, because we will need that for the foundation anyway. It's early stage. We're just at the beginning to do so, but it's so interesting to see that that you have these kind of culture in so many different countries, and how it was evolved, and there was a kind of a cooperative slaughtering in the UK around about 20 years ago, and why that happened, and how they want to fix it now, and la 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 la. It's really fascinating. Also, lore can be really a fascinating aspect of our life.